How do we build the motivation for change? Well, that's a very interesting question. So I guess first of all, we need to start with ourselves and understand why we're so connected or committed to that change process. Do we believe in it? Do we understand why we need it? And by looking at that, we're really intrinsically looking at how we link into the change process and guide and lead it. If we can't find that connection, we've got to continue to look through that. It's not good enough to just say, I need to do it as part of my job, even though that might be part of the reality. So by building motivation, you might look at researching and understanding some of the other successful change processes that have occurred. You might engage with other change agents from other organisations who have successfully navigated a change process of significance. You may discuss it with your significant others and understand what their concepts are around change. The first thing that we need to do around building motivation is make sure we've got a lock on why it's of interest to us. Extrinsic motivation, which is just saying, well, it's part of my job, will not get us there over the time around change. Even though you can have the right systems and processes, at some point in time, your motivation will be tested, because change is generally hard. If you think back to things you've heard earlier in this course, and indeed on the alternate video that I've done, we talk about changing behaviours and habits of people that could be well entrenched over a long period of time. So subsequently, we've got to lock on to what's going to motivate us. Now, if we look at what's going to motivate others, we've got to look at the very simple concept, and you would have heard this before, of WIFM, which is what's in it for me. We've got to understand what is in it for other people and how can it add value to their lives. How can we make their lives easier through navigating through a successful change process? And by understanding that conceptually, we can start to tie our actions back to making sure we're going to meet their needs. Change is hard, change is tough, but we do it every day. We just don't recognise it as change. And moving forward, the bigger projects, even the smaller projects for that matter, life in general, disruption is normal now. So we've got to be well skilled and ready to change. The final piece around motivation that I would ask you to consider is, and I've spoken about this earlier and you would have heard more about this on the program, is have I got the mental capacity? Have I got the right thinking style in place to be able to navigate the change? Now, this can be tough. It's looking at self-reflection in the deepest format and also looking at emotional intelligence. Have I got the resilience? Have I got the courage to have the conversations I need to? I guess from my perspective, I've found where the intrinsic motivation lines up with the extrinsic motivation, we start to be able to navigate through a successful change process. Well, first of all, we've got to recognise what are the important priorities around change. And to do that, I would suggest you look at just grabbing a prioritisation matrix and start to work through what's the most important priorities I need to work on. So before we can actually juggle the priorities, we've got to recognise what we're actually focused on and what's most important. However, that being said, even when we get to the point of understanding that, we're going to have different elements of our job. If we're not necessarily working a full-time change agent role, then we're going to be doing it part-time as well as our normal duties. And that comes with making sure we can still meet the demands and requirements of our core role whilst moving this change agent process or role forward. To do that, what I've found works best is segmenting up our day to make sure we've got the right amount of time to deal with the change process. Now, that could be an hour, it could be 2, it could be 5, depending on what the needs of the change are and how broad they are, as well as segmenting up our day in terms of diary management to get our core duties done. That all being said, we'll still have a reactional element to our role in and around big projects. So to meet that demand, what we've got to be able to do is communicate really well with others to explain that you're working on important change, you're also working on your core role, and as part of that, they may need to provide you some flexibility to make sure you've got the time and space to be able to deal with the roles, the different roles that you're now undertaking. And if all that fails, then quickly run away. Just joking. What we want you to do then is say, okay, I need to engage with senior people or alternate change agents that may be within the organisation, or create a coalition of change agents within the project or the organisation. And that coalition is a way in which we can spread work throughout the team. But for that to work, we've got to have our project management approach up and going, with ways of measuring it and understanding the steps. So again, to recap, go back, prioritise well, and when those priorities start to conflict, we've got to be able to have open conversations around what may occur and how we can actually navigate through it. There's some tips for quick wins when it comes to decision making. Well, first of all, we need to agree how we're going to make decisions around change. So when we've mapped out our process or our change approach through whatever tool you're going to use, we need to agree who are the important stakeholders and decision makers, and how do we agree to make decisions. It might sound really basic, but it's often a step forgotten. A lot of the work we do around GSI with teams is actually putting them in a scenario that's heightened, and they have to make decisions. Now, as late as last week, I did this, and as part of that process, what was really interesting, a high-performing team in their day-to-day environment, when we put them into a new environment, they forgot how they made decisions, because, as I've said earlier, we get into habits and ways of working. So if we agree how we're going to make decisions, we agree who the key stakeholders are, that's the first steps to creating quick wins in terms of decision making. The third thing I suspect that we need to look at is making sure our initial decisions are quite simple, and for the want of a better term, no-brainers. Because if they make sense, we can start to get a great cadence around decision making. And that cadence can be quite positively reinforcing, and it can ensure that people feel comfortable making decisions in change processes. So if we get that cadence moving, then there's a likelihood that more and more people are going to get involved in the change process, or at least feel comfortable through the agreed decision-making process to make the decisions in change. The fourth thing that I would suggest we look at from a quick wins in terms of decision-making is making sure that we have our structure that allows the decision-makers to come together regularly and quite quickly, because a change could move very fast through an organisation, or quite efficiently, or it could take a long time depending on what the change process looks like. So having our structure that enables us to know who's making the decision, how they're making it, how we agree to make it, where there's consultation required, where there's not, etc., and then making sure we get them together regularly, that would be the 3 or 4 key things that I would see required to have some quick wins in terms of decision making. Quick wins around dealing with lack of funding is an interesting one. So in my experience, there's never enough money allocated for a change process. That's the first thing. The reason is because often people allocating the budgets don't understand the depth or understanding of change, because if they did, they'd actually be in the change agency. So they might put a big number up there and say, or a little number, depending on what it is, and say that will do. Quite often I also see there is no money associated with change processes, which means that as a change agent, you can be sitting there thinking, how do I actually get the resources I need? So if we go back to basics around that, first thing is I would start to look at how do I make sure that I've got a budget in mind, and how do I start to bring that to life through the management structure. Interesting enough, when we talk budgets, there's always money you can find. I shouldn't say always, because sometimes it can be tough, but there's generally money you can find within a project or within an organisation that is available for change if they can see the return on investment. And that's the piece that I would encourage you to look at. Building a budget of understanding. Now, not a big budget that scares people off, but a realistic budget, depending on what the change is, that starts to talk about the return on investment. If we change something, the assumption that we should be looking at is something else should be more efficient and effective, which means we've got money that should realise at that point in time. We've got to be able to articulate that. And so if we move from here to here, we should have a better way of working, which means we should get a return on that investment. I think the third thing is be really, really crafty engage well with your admin people, engage well with the various service or functional areas within projects and businesses like HR, safety. If there is a change agent network in your broader business, engage with them. Find out what tools are available straight away. They may have a full suite of documents around change that you can use, which means you don't have to go and start from scratch. That'll save you time and money. They may have access to other funding within the corporate area that says we can deal with change in this way. They may also want to use it as a case study to look at how you could do change more broadly across many various projects within the organisation that you work. So be crafty and ask questions. And often what I see around change is we make assumptions that there is no money, or we'll have someone say, and there's no money for that, whereas there's generally always some sort of funds available. So the first thing is be brave enough to ask questions. Secondly is be really organised at creating your budget. That budget will talk about return on investment. Third is investigate and research what's available inside your organisation in terms of looking at what other resources might be available or funding within the broader organisation. And the fourth thing is, depending on what the change is, there may be external funding available through various government programs or pilot programs because they might want to test something. So look at that as well. And the fifth thing is, be really, really crafty at using internal resources. If you're finding other people that are in the coalition for change, that resourcing might help you deliver something that you couldn't have done elsewhere. Regrouping when things don't seem to be changing can be very tough. So let's not suggest it's easy. You've poured your heart and soul into this change process and you haven't been able to sort of move the momentum forward. The first thing, and I've alluded to this earlier in the video, was make sure you've got your supports around you. Those supports are there for the good and for the challenging. That's the first thing that we need to recognise, that as a change agent, it can be a very lonely existence. You can be pushing, you can be negotiating, you can be consulting, you can be doing all the good work, and if you don't have your supports around you, then regrouping is going to be tough. So number one is get your supports around you. Number two is don't be so hard on yourself. Change is tough. So when we're reflecting on our own performance, often as change agents, because we've got that big goal in mind, we can get worried or concerned if it doesn't seem to be flowing as nice as we would like to see it flow, or if it's not quite on plan. Change is hard, because if you think about this at a basic level, we're changing something up here in people. We're changing their thinking preference. We're changing how they do things. Because most of the change processes we talk about are people-orientated changes. So reflect with honesty, but also reflect with empathy and compassion upon the journey that you're embarked upon, because if it was easy, there'd be change agents everywhere, and frankly, there's not. And often on the projects you're on, it is likely you are one of the key few change agents, if not the only one. So that can be quite a lonely existence. So make sure you're compassionate to yourself. The third thing is be aware of your thinking style and your mental health. If we're not aware of how we're feeling about a circumstance, we can go down a fairly challenging path, because we may not see or feel for ourselves until it's too late. So what I mean by that is we could be so embraced or entrenched in the change that we miss an opportunity to look after ourselves. So nurturing yourselves or using self-actualization techniques, which sounds very hippie-ish, and I apologise, but it's not meant to be. It's looking after yourself, nurturing yourself to make sure you're trying to strive for effectiveness becomes really important around the regroup. Then you've got the facts. So then you've got the facts to deal with. After you've looked after yourself and you've started to show empathy and compassion to yourself, then we've got to look at the facts of where we're at. And to do that, go back to the good structure and systems that you've placed there earlier, such as your change plan, using the theoretical models and theories that you're tracking against. So we've developed toolkits in IPS that make sure we can track the change process, so we can see where we're at day in, day out, got an action plan there day in, day out, and those facts become really easy to focus on. So when we get to the facts, not opinions, we can see where we're actually at with the change process, and then we can regroup. Whereas what I find with a lot of people when they're navigating through change is they take opinions from here, there and elsewhere, and those opinions become overwhelming because, as I said earlier, often we are dealing with changing people's behaviours that have had those entrenched for a period of time. So when regrouping, deal with the facts. Those facts become really relevant when you're starting to look at navigating the next steps. And most of all, just be kind to yourself. So back to the compassion, be kind to yourself, because change is hard. We do it every day. We don't recognise we do it every day. So when you're actually dealing and having to regroup, be aware of yourself, deal with the facts, and then look at how you pragmatically set up the plan to move to the next level. In closing, your role within these projects and within your corporations is pivotal for sustainability within Australia. And from a sustainability perspective, it can be really tough being out there as the Lone Ranger, for the want of a better term, who is just continuing to push and advocate. You know, I often say you push, bite, chew, kick. But the reality is you will get there. And when I say you'll get there, you may not meet all the change requirements through a big change process. But what you'll be able to do is look into yourself and understand that you've worked hard to create a change for either someone else or a bunch of other people on a big project or within your businesses. And that's really rewarding, as long as you reward yourself. Always remember to have your supports. Always remember to reach out to others. They're probably going through something very similar. And my final guidance would be this: enjoy it. Enjoy the opportunity to make a significant change. Enjoy the opportunity to put your footprint on Australia, assuming this isn't going outside of Australia, and making sure that you can do it in a way that looks after others. So best of luck with your change journeys.